Right, so what have we done so far? I've introduced the notion of identity. I've talked about we took the fact that we're interested in numerical identity. I introduced the notion of numerical identity in the first video, explained a bit about it. In the second video we looked at Endurantism, a particular view about how objects exist over time, and drew out some problems for it. But the features of Endurantism then is that things exist wholly and completely at each time at which they exist. So, I'm here wholly and completely, and I was there wholly and completely in 1981, and I am exactly the same numerically identical thing as that thing is. They can undergo changes in their properties, but that requires the Endurantist to think of properties as being indexed to times. So that's just a feature of the view. Some people, like David Lewis, think that that's problematic, at least with regards to intrinsic properties. But it seems to me that Endurantists can just happily accept that that's true. And then we had a look at criterion of identity. We focused on persons, about what makes a person identical over time, and we looked at the psychological theorist, the Neo-Lockean, who thinks that the identity over time of persons is constituted by the holding of psychological connections, or overlapping chains of psychological connections. But then we considered a problem for that view: what happens in cases where a person splits into two, as it were. They're called fission cases, because fusion is where things fuse together, fission is where things break apart. So what happens in fission cases? And there was a little bit of, not quite clear what's going on there. Now then, we're now going to consider the second view, which is called Perdurantism. And this is going to give us another way out of all of this. And Perdurantism is the view that persisting things let's just put it like this, are made up of separate parts that exist at each time at which the thing exists, at which the things exist. Something like that. That's not a great definition, but you'll get the idea. It denies, in other words, that things are wholly and completely present at each time at which they exist. So let's just take me again. So here was me as a baby in 1981. Here's me now in 2020. And before, on the Endurantist view, we were saying I was wholly present here and I'm wholly present here, and there's this literal identity which holds between the thing here and the thing here. That was Endurantist. On the Perdurantis view, you say, no, this thing in 1981 is one thing, me in 2020 is an entirely separate thing, so non-identical, but we're both, this thing is a temporal part of me, and this thing is a temporal part of me, and what I am, really, is not the thing that's here now and the thing that's there then. I am, so, okay, remember there's going to be a bunch of stages in the middle as well. I am the collection of all my stages, right? So, boom, boom, boom. There's loads of different stages of me, and I'm the worm. It gets called the worm view sometimes. I'm the space-time worm that's made up of all of these parts. Okay? So Endurantism says I am strictly and literally identical to the thing in 1981. Perdurantism says no, you're not, or no, I'm not. There's a part of me that's present now. There was a part of me that's present then, but in fact, not the same thing. Okay, that's the view. So hopefully you can see that this is how this differs from Endurantism. Things persist over time by having different temporal parts at each time at which they exist. Another way of putting it. Right, so let's consider some of the cases then. Now, the first thing I want to consider then is, let's clear this. the first thing I want to consider is, remember when we turn to the question of how things exist over time, or what identity over time consists in, we put it like this: person X at T1 is identical with person Y at T2 if and only if, and then we gave the psychological account, and Parfit thought that he had to add a second condition about there's no other thing that bears the psychological relations to the earlier thing. Well, this is probably, well, it's not really an apt way of putting it, because this is supposing that there is a person wholly and completely present at T1 and present at T2 which bear this, which are numerically identical with each other. Bad way of putting it, again, English gets in the way, but those, right, the thing at that time are numerically are one and the same thing. But the Perdurantist doesn't think that that's the case, so we're going to have to write this slightly differently. And the more apt way of writing it is to put it as follows. Okay. Person stage X at T1. So now remember, persons don't exist wholly and completely at times. Person parts or person stages do. So if we imagine the little baby in 1981 that was me, really that was just a part of me. So we can call it a person stage. It's not a person, because a person is the collection of person stages. This is just a person stage. And our question is going to be, person stage X at T1 is part of some person, or is part of the same person as person stage Y at T2 if and only if. So our question now is not what makes a thing identical over time. The question is what ties different person stages into one worm, right? What is it that makes two person stages part of some same person, which is a worm, right? It's a question of parthood rather than identity. So importantly, what we've done then, we've kind of replaced the idea of identity over time with parthood. And we can fill it in the same way. We can still hold a psychological account, so we can say if and only if person, so I'll illustrate this in a minute, person stage X at T1 is psychologically connected by overlapping chains. So maybe I've put this, so is connected by overlapping psychological chains, something like that. You'll get the idea. Is psychologically connected by overlapping chains to person stage Y at T2. Okay? So it looks pretty similar, and we've got the same kind of a condition, but now what we're saying is not that bearing a psychological relation to a past self makes the thing that bears it, so that you now are not identical with the thing that used to exist. Rather, the person part which exists where you are is part of the same person as, right, the person stage that used to exist. So these psychological connections, they don't, as it were, constitute a unity. They don't sort of make you identical with anything else, but what they do is they tie together the different parts of a person into one person. Okay, and I won't talk about this, but it's going to be the same with tables and chairs and whatnot. So instead of saying table X at T1 is identical with table Y at T2 if and only if table X at T1 is spatiotemporally continuous with table Y at T2, it's now going to be table stage X at T1 is part of the same table as table stage Y at T2 if and only if table stage X at T1 is spatiotemporally continuous with table stage. So it applies to everything, not just persons. Every persisting thing is really a worm that's made up of different segments, which are bound together into the whole, which is the whole worm, bound together as parts into a whole. So it's on an analog, I suppose, of a spatial case, right? So just as, think about it like this: if you're looking at a so if you're looking at what's this one? Is this a blank board? Yeah. So if you're looking at a let's just use a person. If you're looking at a person, and you're focusing on this hand over here, and then you focus in on this hand over here. I mean, we could say we could call A and B. You could say that A is identical with B if you're pointing over here, and by that you could take yourself, when you're pointing at the hand, to be pointing at the whole person, as it were, because you can point at a whole person by pointing at a bit of their body. So when you point at A and then you point at B, you could say that because you could take yourself to be pointing just twice at the whole person. But another thing you might think is, well, no, I'm pointing at a part of a person. So A names just this part and B names just this part. And then, of course, these are two separate things. This is one hand, this is another thing, another hand. So they're non-identical, but they're parts of a person, but they're tied. They're parts of the same person because there's this kind of, they're tied together across space by some sort of a principle which unites these two parts with the head and the body and all the rest. I hope you can see that there's this. It's not not very clear, but I hope you can see the analog there. Anyway, we're going to make this clear by considering our example again. Now, think about the example that we had. We had this example of Earth, and then the person A at T1 stepping into this teletransportation device, which then beamed up to Mars, a duplicate of that person, and which we call B. So this is at T2. And we had this idea, well, okay, is A identical with B? We no longer say that. We say, well, are A and B parts of some same person? Right? That's the Perdurantist way of thinking about it. And then we were imagining that there's some sort of a mistake, such that over here to Venus, then it beams up another duplicate to Venus, we called C. And before we had this problem where we said, well, if we say that A is identical with B, then because C bears the same psychological relation, we have to say that A is identical with C, but then we get out that B is identical with C. They're one and the same person. That doesn't look right. The problem was created because of the transitivity and symmetricality of identity, if you remember. But now let's think about what the Perdurantist says. Well, the Perdurantist is going to say, look, the psychological relations hold between A and B, so A and B are part of some person, just call them P1, okay? And then there is this psychological relation, so we say A and C are part of some person P2, we can say. But look, from that, we cannot get out that B and C are part of some person. So, just to be clear, we can't get that conclusion out. And the reason is that the part of relation, unlike the identity relation, is not symmetrical and transitive, right? In particular, it's not going to be transitive. If one thing is part of another and that is part of something else, hang on, is it transitive? there's some reason why this doesn't work. No, it can't be transitive. A and B are part of some person P1. A and B. Yeah. No, it's yeah. Maybe it's the symmetricality that fails. In fact, if A is part of I'll have to think about this again. So I can't remember whether it's symmetricality or I can't work it out off the top of my head. But the point is, it doesn't follow. I mean, you can actually see that, right? So it's easy to see why it doesn't follow. Yeah, it's not transitive. That's what it's going to be. Yeah, it's right. It's not transitive. So, but it's easy to see this illustrated. So let's schematically represent what's going on here. Okay, and we'll do this on yet another board. So schematically, what's going on is we've got a person at let's do it in black. We've got a person at one time, okay, and then we've got two other people. To be strict about it, we've got a person part at one time and two person parts at another time, which are connected up with the original person in the right way. And let's just draw in a few more stages of them. So at this point there's no split. And imagine the split takes place at this point. So then we've got these people, or these person stages over here, and these person stages over here, each of which, right, so this is just the split that we just imagined. Schematically then, what's going on is these person stages form part of some person. That worm is some person. We can call that person 1. And these person stages, when the split takes place with those later person stages, form part of another person, and that's person 2. Right. So look, here was our A, here was our B, and here was our C. Look, A and B are part of some same person. Let's just colour that one in blue. The blue person. And A and C are part of some same person, which we can colour in red. But it doesn't follow that B and C are part of some same person. They're not. B is part of the blue person, C is part of the red person. There's no single person that's the same. So remember here that the person is the whole worm, and the individual things here are just person stages. Alright. So in this case, the Perdurantists can explain what's going on by saying, well, what's going on here is, in fact, when a person splits, indeed, there is a sense in which the earlier person is identical with the later person. Well, by that I just mean that, there's a part of a person here and a part of a person there, and they're part of some same person. And they can maintain that that's what is going on. There is, however, a further difficulty here. So remember that when we talked about Endurantism, it looked as though, unless you want to add in this non-identity clause, as Parfit did, and say, well, okay, you survive if there's a psychological continuum of you, so long as there's not another psychological continuum knocking around somewhere, and then you don't survive, which is a bit odd. Or you have to say, on the Endurantist view, that in fact the two psychological continuums are identical, even though they could play tennis with each other and go. That's a bit odd. Well, this is another way around it, but there is also something odd about this, because if we say, okay, how many persons are present at T1? So, for sure there's only one person stage here, but that person stage is part of two persons. There's an overlap here, a temporal overlap between person 1 and person 2. So that person stage is part of two persons. So in fact, we will have to say that there are two persons present in one body. So there we go. It's problematic, but some people think so. David Lewis, who defends this view, thinks that's okay, because he says, well, normally we don't count by persons, we count by person stages. And he gives an analogy which is supposed to make this plausible, where he says, imagine that you're trying to reach, I don't know, a castle. There's a castle. So imagine you're trying to reach a castle, and there's this river in the way. Okay. So there's the river. And you want to take the most direct route to it. Okay, there's the river. And you're over here. And you can imagine this goes on for like, I've not drawn this very well, but the curves go like hundreds of miles in one direction, so something. You say, well, how many rivers have you got to cross? Well, if somebody says you've only got to cross one river, there's a sense in which they're not really, I mean, it is accurate. You have only got to cross one river, but you've got to cross it 3 times. But somebody else might say, well, you've got to cross 3 rivers, because in this case what you're doing is you're counting by river parts and not rivers, right? So, strictly speaking, it's true that you've only got to cross one river. But really, you know, we would say that you've got to cross 3, because in this instance we don't, if someone says how many rivers have I got to cross, we'd count by river parts rather than rivers. That's his idea. And he says, look, so sometimes we don't count strictly by identity. And he says, in this case, if you say how many people are in the room, normally what we do when we count the people in a room is we don't count strictly speaking by persons, we count by person stages. So, although this is strictly speaking true, we wouldn't ordinarily say it. We'd ordinarily say there's just one person in the room, because we count by person stages. So perhaps there are ways around that. But nonetheless, it does seem rather weird to consider the fact that there might be 2 persons in one place. And you might say, well, okay, that's okay, because this is just in very weird situations where there's this splitting or something like that. And maybe you could make the same case for Endurantism. But there are cases where, in fact, this arises even in ordinary, everyday cases. So I won't describe them now. Maybe we can talk about them in the seminar. But there we go. I'll leave it at that for this week then. So the bulk of the work was done in the setup here. So this video is a bit shorter than the others, but that's okay. I think I've taken up just about the right amount of time. One last thing though before I finish, and that is there is one other view which is discussed in the textbook. I'm not going to discuss it too much in these videos because it's a widely, I mean, it's kind of discussed but not held very seriously. It is a kind of interesting view, and maybe we can talk about it in the seminar, and it's called the stage view. Yeah, so have a look at that in the book and see what you make of it anyway, and we can talk about it in the seminar perhaps. And yeah, okay, so thanks very much, and I will see you in the seminars.